If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the creepiest, most unnerving thing you have experienced that you can't explain? This was circa 2002. I was about 8. Me, my dad, and my stepmom at the time were on our way from California to Tennessee by plane. Once we landed, we got out of the plane and waited for my dad to turn on his phone to call my aunt, who was waiting for us at the airport. We wait a couple of minutes, and my dad has a ton of missed calls from my aunt freaking out about where we were. He called her back, and she's asking us where we've been and that they've been waiting for 2.5 hours. We were pretty confused because our flight got there in a normal amount of time without delays, but somehow we lost 2.5 hours of our time. Time changed from CA to TN aside. Once we met up with them down at baggage, our carousel was completely empty of luggage and other passengers. We had to go pick up our baggage somewhere because it had been unclaimed for too long. I still don't know what happened or how we lost this much time. It felt very weird and surreal for the rest of the night. I was about 13 years old when this happened and home alone. Mom was out with my siblings, and Dad was working FIFO, so I was definitely alone. I had a pet cat called Misty, whom I loved dearly. She was the sweetest animal I'd ever known, and I could never have dreamed of harming a hair on her fuzzy gray head. So, this particular day I was sitting on our front porch giving Misty a brush, just enjoying the sunshine, when out of nowhere I heard a male voice in my left ear quite calmly yet urgently say, "Throw the cat, go inside." I was compelled to obey this command instantly. I threw Misty off our meter-high porch towards the front yard and turned to go inside. The second my hand touched the door handle, a glass light shade fell and shattered right where she and I had been sitting. Had I not moved, I would have been showered in razor-sharp 30 to 40-year-old glass shards. Misty took a while to forgive my brash action towards her, but I was grateful for whichever entity was looking out for us that day. I have other stories from that house, but that one stands out the most for me. One night I was over at a friend's house in the middle of summer, and we decided to go outside. We were just walking around talking about random stuff when we both glanced over towards the front of his house and saw a tall gray thing. It had arms, legs, and a head that was sticking up over a van on the side of his house. It was walking towards the house and went behind a wall. We quickly looked at each other and just stared for a second, both confused. We walk over to where we saw it to investigate what the hell we just saw. We didn't see anything, but we did see his mom next to the door that leads inside the house. She has severe schizophrenia and is always talking to other people, I should add, so he asked her if she saw anything, and she went from slightly dancing and singing to herself to a super serious face. She yells, "Yeah, it was the tall gray man," and starts laughing hysterically, probably thinking she imagined it. I'm still on the fence about whether it was a ghost or if two sane people and a not sane person imagined the same thing. So, when I was a Boy Scout at the age of 13, I remember shaving late one night on a camping trip and having the most difficult time sleeping. It was impossible, and it just wasn't happening. After a few hours of just lying there and failing to sleep, I sat up for a moment in annoyance. Now, my tent was a giant mesh dome, so I could see all around me. Well, when I sat up, I saw in the distance between these two bushes what looked like the silhouette of a man, maybe a park ranger, and what looked like a dog. It surprised me at first. I was like, "Dafak?" What was creepy wasn't that they were there, it was that they weren't moving. At all. And they were facing me. I felt chills go down my spine. I remember constantly sitting up and lying down and looking at this mysterious figure in the distance, each time noting that it still hadn't moved. Finally, morning comes, and the figure isn't there anymore. I went over to the spot to see if I could see if something made that shadow, if it was a tree stump or something. But that opening in the bushes was entirely empty. No bark, no wood, no rocks, no footprints. To this day, that memory still kind of freaks me out, and I have no clue what was staring at me that night. My friend was dropping me off at my old apartment complex. I was finishing a cigarette, and we were having a particularly good conversation, so we decided to chill outside the car near my house for a while. The apartment was all the way in the back of the complex, near a small wooded area. During our conversation, I kept hearing what sounded like voices talking over static, like an old radio quickly switching between channels, but with consistent voices over top of it. It sounded like it was moving through the forest. My friend is a huge skeptic, so when I brought it up, he dismissed it. Probably a car on the road on the other side of the woods. But it sounded so close and so bizarre. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I dropped it. I remember pointing out one of the sentences the voice said. I have since sadly forgotten it, but I remember it being strange. Mid-conversation, I notice something, and the conversation stops. "Do you see that?" my friend asked. I did. It was a small baseball-sized orb. It was solid and translucent almost at the same time, with a faint glow coming from it. It was traveling slowly and fluidly up and down through the parking lot, eventually floating right between us. Coming from the orb was the same sound I had heard from the forest. Voices talking over static. My friend said when he looked into the core of the orb, he saw what he described as a city. The orb eventually reached a patch of grass, where it stopped, slowly sank down into the ground, and vanished. Immediately after, and I hate telling this part because it makes this sound like a really bad ghost story, it happened, and even though it was probably a coincidence, we heard the loudest blood-curdling scream I've ever heard coming from that direction. We instantly got back in the car and drove the duck out of there. I made him drive us around for like 20 minutes before I felt comfortable going back home. I didn't sleep that night. I live in a small town called LaSalle around the bigger city of Windsor, Ontario, and probably 20 years ago now, as a young tyke, my mother and I, along with her boyfriend at the time, lived right outside LaSalle in another even smaller county called Amherstburg out on a concession way out in the boonies, and one night the whole house erupted with absolute shock, awe, and unexplained phenomena. So the story goes like this. In this small little farmhouse live my mother, myself, and her boyfriend, along with our 2 dogs, a pit bull and a shepherd/lab mix. I slept on the main floor and my parents upstairs. Now the living room leads either to my bedroom in the far back of the house, my room, or up the stairs to my parents' room. So I remember waking up screaming out of a dead sleep. My pit bull, who slept with me, was also howling and crying, and I just remember seeing this green floating, thing at the end of my bed, so I jumped up and jetted out the door, grabbing my completely scared to death pit bull on my way out, only to hear my mother and stepdad start to scream and panic, and as I walk out of my room half asleep, the green being was now hovering over the furnace that was situated right outside my door. I paused and froze up immediately as my pit started to yelp out even louder, and then I finally managed the courage to run upstairs and find my mother bawling out of straight fear with her boyfriend also deeply troubled. They had apparently heard 2 women being tortured with a full-sized transport truck or very large truck running, engine sound, from what seemed to have come from right outside their window, and when her boyfriend went out to look, there wasn't a car or any movement in sight. Once she calmed down, I explained to her my paranormal situation, and she brought me back downstairs and made sure everything was alright. The green being seemed to have disappeared, so I was tucked back into bed. An ex-girlfriend of mine used to live on this small, rural island in Minnesota called Gray Cloud Island. At one point, the island had the highest concentration of Indian burial mounds in the county. There is a lot of history there, and it was once considered sacred. Across the street from my ex's mailbox was a long, overgrown gravel driveway blocked off by a rusty chain. On one of our early evening jaunts, we decided to step over the chain and make our way down this driveway, which was a good 1/4 of a mile long, if not more. The driveway opened up into a small clearing of sorts, in the center of which was all that remained of a home's foundation, then little more than a rectangular patch of concrete. The trees that ringed the clearing were sparse in some places and thicker in others, but even so, we could see a lot of the ground beyond the clearing, grassy, humped ground. Trees. Nothing else. The ex-girlfriend had a blanket, which she spread out on the patch of concrete. We lay down together and talked for some time, listening to the sounds of the approaching night. Dusk had just crept in, falling over everything like a cold black cloaking shroud, when he heard movement in the woods nearby, the stealth crackle of branches, crunching leaves. It was very close, much too close for comfort. From the sound of it, it was no more than 20 yards away. Surely we would have heard its approach from a ways off? We got up as if by mutual unspoken agreement and, in the new darkness, made our way to the driveway. The sound of something approaching from the woods, changed. It was now in the clearing, where he had been only moments before. As shit scared as ever I've been, I broke into a run that was immediately arrested by my girlfriend, who urgently whispered, "Don't run. It provokes chase." I did as she commanded, and together, in silence, we moved back down the driveway, moving as fast as we could without actually running. By the time we got to the street, the sounds were gone. "What do you think that was?" I asked her. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, stone-faced. She was 100% Native American. I knew she knew more than she let on, but regardless of how much I pried, she never told me what it was. To this day, I wonder. I have one story. It was around 10 p.m., and me and my friends decided that it was a good idea to play hide and seek at 11 p.m. Yes, 1 hour had passed. So, when we started to play, I ran in the middle of the forest. When I hid around a tree, I saw a woman in a white dress staring at me. Naturally, I got scared and ran outside the forest. Meanwhile, on the way out, I got a cut about 3 to 4 inches long on my left hand. I saw it only when I got out of the woods. When my friends got the balls to do it, they saw her too, and we ran to the highway. Yes, there is a highway about 200 feet long. The night passed and we didn't play anymore, but I had a camera at home, which I didn't use anymore. I decided to put a 128 gigabytes SD card in it and place it near the tree I hid around to let it record, and when my friend got up in the morning and stopped the camera, the woman suddenly disappeared at 3 a.m. My parents live on 5 acres in Michigan, with the nearest neighbor about 3/4 of a mile away. Otherwise, it's all cornfields, creeks, and forests around them. In 2015, I was staying with them for a period of time, along with my dog. One night in early fall, after midnight and long after my parents were in bed, I was curled up on my bed reading. My dog was right next to me, head in my lap, sleeping, when I heard an incredibly loud, blood-curdling scream. This scream was unlike any I've ever heard. It sounded female and absolutely terrified, tortured, even. Like something horrific was happening to the person it was coming from. And it sounded like it came right from the living room, or at least from somewhere inside the house. If I had been the only one to hear it, I probably would have chalked it up to an electrical misfiring between my brain and ears or something else. But my dog absolutely heard it too. She went from snoring to being on full alert, hackles raised, nose pointed at the bedroom door. Opening the door, she simply refused to leave the room and go check on the house with me. I think that scared me the most. Her aversion was visible. In our 12 years together, I've never seen her hackles raised like that before or since, from neck to tail, like a rigid mohawk. She wasn't going to pass the threshold from my room to the hallway if she had anything to say about it. I did check the living room and all the other rooms. There was nothing. There are no animals in the yard. My parents didn't hear a thing. But me and my best girl absolutely did, and I've never been able to explain it. This is some SHT I have no other way to describe other than paranormal. Rewind 8 to 7 years ago. I was living in a house in a small farm town that had nothing creepy about it. It was almost Victorian in style. It was pretty nice on the inside, there was nothing creepy about it. I was around 11 years old. Over the course of the year and a half that my family lived there, we all experienced our own level of freaky, unknown shit. One night in late August or early September, the town had plans to cut all electricity so they could work on some transformers. This was scheduled for 10 in the evening. The time I usually go to bed, so, with my parents, we all head to bed. Sometime during the middle of the night, when I wake up or am in some form of consciousness, I walk down the stairs and stand a few stairs below the landing before the second set of stairs going to the second floor. The stairwell had one set of stairs going from the living room to a landing with a sliding door, then another small set of stairs before reaching the bedroom floor. I notice all the lights are on despite the fact that they should all be off because of the town's maintenance. I looked into the living room. From my position on the stairs, I was overlooking the porch and living room and could see a small portion of the dining room to the left of the living room. Standing in the middle of the living room was a hunched back figure who was wearing a cloak of sorts. On the shoulders of the figure were various bird feathers and skulls. There were a few human skulls, which really ducked with me. They were holding a gnarled piece of wood that was topped by an entire human skull, and their hands were really wrinkled and bony. It scared me. In a really smooth and melodic voice, the figure started talking and turned towards me. The best way I can describe this voice is that it had the power of a full-grown man's voice but was subtle and inviting like a grandmother's voice. It kept repeating the following. "It's okay, you can wake up now, the lights are back on. The cosmic gorilla, it's okay now, you can wake up, the lights are back on. It's okay, you can wake up now, the lights are back on." I walked back up the stairs and laid back down in bed, and the best way to describe it is that I woke up. I got up for school and pretty much forgot about it until the end of the night. I was getting ready to go on a walk with my dad and our dog. We were going down to the practice football field so he could help me out on some pass formations so I could practice for the new position I had on the team. When suddenly I remembered the incident the night before, it suddenly hit me how ducked up it was. I run inside, and I'm telling my dad he has to hear what happened. I tell him, and you can visibly tell from his reaction that it scared him or really caught him off guard. He tells me that it was probably nothing more than a bad dream, but I'm telling him that there's no way it was a dream. It was way too real. It felt extremely real. After I tell my dad everything that happened, I run back outside to wait for him to go on our walk. I waited maybe 10 to 15 minutes and went back inside, and he was sitting on the couch holding my stepmother. I could tell something had happened. I ask what happened, and he starts to tell me how he was telling her about what I experienced, and as he was getting to the part of describing the figure, she fell to the floor and almost fainted but caught herself, saying she was really lightheaded and didn't feel good as he started to say it. That night on our walk, my dad told me things he and my stepmom experienced in the house, and I did the same thing. Within 2 weeks, we moved out and put it in our past. We never speak about the house or the things that happened to any of us in it. When I was really young, I'd spend time in the country with my cousin. We found an old set of golf clubs in one of the many abandoned barns around the area. We used to pretend to be swordsmen or whatever. This was in the mid to late 90s. We stored them at the house weeks before. We went from one abandoned barn to another, to its basement. It wasn't scary, the floor above us had rotted through, so it was very well lit. It was lined with these 2 or 3 foot tall concrete circles, and they were empty with dirt at the bottom. After exploring it a little, my cousin realized he forgot his golf club, so we couldn't play whatever silly video game inspired game we planned, so he opted to walk back to the house. So I leaned up against one of those concrete circles and watched him walk back, as the house was within eyeshot. As he was walking up the step to his house, I heard a strange, low, unearthly voice say my name. Barriolas. Hey, Barriolas. I need to show you something. I froze. I held my club tight against my body. And it kept getting louder and stranger sounding. It wasn't any voice I'd recognized, and again, I cannot stress how alien it sounded. Not demonic, not scary, even. Just unlike anything I can even describe. It was coming from the concrete circle I was leaning against, getting louder still. So finally, I turned around with my golf club held above my head and stepped up on this bucket to peek inside, and nothing. In the same moment, I heard my cousin running back, coming from the house. I ran to him, we searched the place together, and there was nothing. There were no signs of footsteps, no disturbed dirt, or anything that would suggest anyone had ever been there at all. There are 2 things that duck me up about this story beyond the situation itself. 1, there was no way for anyone or anything to get behind me or above me. While the floor above was rotted out, sunshine lit everything, and it was in the very back corner, so there were walls on both sides, all the way up to the 2nd floor, with no door or window. 2nd, it was saying my real name. No one calls me by my real name, my white family can't pronounce it, and many of them don't know it. I've run it through my head for decades, and all I can imagine is that it was some brain synapse misfiring or something. When I was in 3rd grade, during recess, we snuck off to the cemetery behind the school. It was October, getting cold, and there were lots of colorful leaves everywhere, which made me happy. Me and 3 other girls went into a family crypt and noticed a cement casket-sized tomb that was slightly opened and peeked inside. For some reason, I felt like we would see snakes or something, but it was empty. I got the feeling we needed to leave, and I started walking back first. I was yelling at the other girls to let's go. When I finally had enough, I said, "Let's go now," like my mom did when we kids didn't listen, but as I said it, I stomped my foot down. I didn't know it, but I was standing on a grave, and I literally felt this beating or pounding under my feet 4 times really quickly. What is so weird about it is that I felt it and heard it. As if someone was banging on a wooden door. I remember jumping up and screaming. I looked at the girls, and they just stared at me. This was in upstate New York. I'm 36 years old now and can take you to exactly where I was when it happened. When I was living with my girlfriend of 5 years at that point, we both had a shared dream experience where we were in some rundown old house. She kept on being chased and attacked by some sort of red fox that was kind of ghostly looking, and that one was always being followed by a smaller blue one. Well, at any rate, I constantly got in the way and would push back the attacker while she gained more distance. By the end of the dream, the red one had eventually bit down onto my arm and injured me, causing me to get mad and somehow evaporate the red one, which made the blue one kind of vanish of its own accord. When we awoke at the same time, we filled in little details that we individually remembered but didn't convey. And here is the best part, we both had scratches and red marks on our bodies where we received injuries in the shared dream. I used to work in music and tour with this band. The guitarist, Josh, of the band's best friend, Matt, had died a couple years ago. He always talked about the kid, and he seemed like a great guy. Josh always had this recurring dream where Matt was standing on this abandoned street, which, supposedly, was metaphorical for purgatory. Josh had all these conversations with Matt in these dreams, and because he had overdosed unexpectedly, he felt like his spirit was not able to move on. At the end of the dreams, Matt would take a bulb from the street light on the street they were standing in the middle of. Josh described these dreams in extreme detail, and I could pretty much picture what the street looked like. Fast forward to about 6 months into touring with these guys. They were huge Bright Eyes fans and wanted to stop in Cassadaga, Florida. Bright Eyes singer wrote an album there, and it's a really creepy, spiritual medium place. It might be worth noting that 6 to 7 of the people I was with are all atheists. So we drive into Cassadaga around 2 or 3 a.m. and drive around. Suddenly, this big black dog comes in the middle of the road and just stops and looks at us. The guys in this band were weird as duck and were saying things like, "Follow the dog. It's trying to show us something." And in my mind, I'm just thinking they are all ducking idiots. We followed this dog for a few blocks, as it was walking pretty slowly. All of a sudden, we turn a corner, and the dog bolts. We try to speed up, but Josh says, "Stop the ducking van. This is it." We are all confused, and he gets out of the van and looks around. This is it. This is the street in my dreams. We hung out for about 15 minutes, and from the way he described the street, from having houses on the left to a park on the right, it was definitely the street. As we get in the van, a street light goes off, and we just drive off. He claims he never had any more dreams about it, as that was closure on everything. When I was young, I would see faceless, formless people peeking around corners and looking at me until I turned my head to look at them. I only ever saw them as a blurry outline in the periphery of my eyes, but their movement and shape were unmistakably humanoid. This would happen often, but I noticed it a lot more when I was alone. One day I decided to play a game with one of them, who would duck away every time I looked. So I would turn away and try to catch it unaware as it began to peek back out again. Every time I looked away longer, it would get bolder, peeking out further and further until I could see a shoulder, a torso, or a leg shuffle out. And eventually it would step out entirely and watch me through the doorway. At this point, I smiled and knew there was no way it could hide in time, so I whipped my head across to look at it and saw something that resembled an emaciated flesh morph suit. I would rather put this down to active imagination, because some things shouldn't be explained. My friend and I decided to visit our mutual friend at her university for the weekend. We set out in the early afternoon, after I finished my classes for the day. I was the driver for this trip. My friend and I had not done this drive before, so our university friend sent us detailed directions. We knew exactly which motorways to take, which shortcuts to take, and even which towns we could and could not speed through. She said the drive should take 3 hours. It was a smooth drive. We didn't hit traffic, and we never deviated from the directions my friend gave us. But the time just kept ticking later and later, and we were still a long way away from our destination. Looking back on the drive, I remember driving through the woods for a very long time. At the time, we didn't think much of it. I thought my friend had exaggerated how short the drive was or had sped down the highways. We finally arrived just in time for dinner. That 3-hour drive took at least an extra hour. We didn't think much of it over the weekend, or even when the drive back seemed so much shorter. But a few months later, when I went to visit again, the woods were gone, and the trip took 3 hours. Over the years, I made that trip half a dozen times, and I was never able to replicate that experience. I don't want to say it was supernatural, but I've also never been able to explain it. It's one of only 2 times in my life that I've experienced something I couldn't quite explain. About 15 years ago, I was visiting my aunt, who lived in Connecticut. I lived in CA at the time, so my mom and her arranged for me to stay in CT the whole summer. My aunt had 2 daughters and was pregnant with the third. My aunt, we'll call her Linda, had me stay in the basement so that I could play my GameCube with COD. My cousins were 11 and 7 at the time. The basement was half renovated, with the unrenovated part accessible only via a single white door. It had the washer and dryer among the storage stuff too. Well, anyway, I was playing COD, and I swear I heard my younger cousin, Olivia, saying, "Luke, come find me." I was told the girls couldn't be down there while I was playing COD, and I didn't recall Olivia coming down the stairs. Either way, I continued to play COD until I heard a faint knocking on the other side of the door, followed by Olvia's voice, "Come on, Luke. Mommy doesn't need to know I'm down here." I told her, "Hey, get out of there right now. You know you're not supposed to be down there." A couple seconds later, I heard it knocking again. Frustrated that I would have to stop playing COD, I go upstairs, and lo and behold, who do I see in the living room watching Little Mermaid? My aunt, Olivia, and Alexandria. Olivia and Alexandria were passed out, and my aunt was stroking Olvia's hair. I pulled my aunt aside and told her. She and I went downstairs and got my GameCube and TV, and she moved me to an upstairs room. After that, she always asked me to go down there with her to do laundry. The creepy part looking back, it gives me chills, but the adolescent me at the time was more angry that I couldn't play my video game. I've spent a few summers in the Boundary Waters. I've seen a few strange things there in my time. Like a giant country hemlock on top of Gardner's Mountain in the Quetico. What was that doing there? I digress. The strangest event to occur to me while working in the region happened late one night while going on a hike along a portage trail with a fellow canoe guide. We stopped for a water break. We had been sitting around chatting for maybe 10 to 15 minutes when there was a loud whoop from the forest. It sounded human or ape-like in nature. From the other direction, a complete 180 from our location, comes another loud whoop. Then another, and another. The sound surrounded us, with whoop coming from every direction. It grew louder and louder, growing to a deafening roar. The two of us sat in fear, looking around with WTF written all over our faces. All at once, it stopped. The woods were silent. I've spent more nights sleeping out of a tent in that region than I have beds. Albeit I don't have a lifetime of experience, in the 4 summers I've spent paddling the waters, I have never run across any manner of beast that sounded like this one. I think the best explanation is most likely a bird or frog. But I don't know. I've always wondered what triggered the event and what kind of animal it was. When I was 12, I went to a friend's house for the day. This was in the UK. My friend's parents were very rich and had this mansion-type place way out in the countryside, North Wales. She had 6 siblings, and her parents were hippie artist types who just let the kids run wild, and we basically never saw them the whole day. Anyway, we were really into acting, so we decided to practice the play we were in our drama group. We went into what was really a ballroom, a massive room with hardly any furniture, lots of paintings, and big windows and French doors. As she was doing her thing and I was watching, I saw a shadow person walk into the room through the big, folding doors behind her. But the person walked sideways, like a crab, so they were actually sidling towards me. She seemed to see nothing and was acting her socks off while this thing came across the room. I saw that it was male, quite tall, and moving in a way as if it didn't want to be seen, like I might not see it if it went sideways. But I did, and I sat there with it getting closer and closer until I jumped up and ran towards my friend, yelling to get out. We did, and she was all, "Oh, that. Yes, people have seen it before. We just ignore it." In 2012, I fell asleep on my couch, lights on and all. I woke up to see a little girl in my house. Her skin was as pale as her dress, she had long black hair and deep, dark eyes, almost as if she didn't have them. They were so pitch dark. She just stood there, watching me. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. Then I felt like hands were all over me, tickling and punching me. She just stood there, calmly walked to the door, and walked through it. Almost immediately, I could move again, and I checked my door, and it was unlocked. I was covered in sweat and wanted to cry, but for some reason I didn't. That was my first sleep paralysis, and it would happen every night until mid-2014, when I moved out. The first night of me not being in that house, it didn't happen, it was a good night's rest. My brother eventually got the house, it was our great-grandparents. My brother has been complaining recently about not sleeping right and seeing things. So back in September 2015, I went over to my brother's to hang out and spent the night since it was getting late. Next thing I know, I wake up, can't move, and see a bunch of shadows moving. Then the girl walks across my view, she walks through the wall, and as soon as she is gone, I can move. About 15 seconds later, I hear a scream, run into my brother's room, and he's sitting on the edge of his bed sweating and having a panic attack. In the morning, he told me he wasn't asleep, he was laying there just thinking. Then a girl walked through the wall, and he became frozen and couldn't move. She walked over to him, got up into his face, and just gazed deep into his eyes before walking away. As soon as she was gone, he could move, and he screamed. He told me he's had weird things happen before but has never seen this girl. What I thought was just a figment of my sleep paralysis may very well have been a ghost or something. My brother has since moved out and hasn't had any problems. I'm Irish and was still living in Tyrone, Ireland, now in the UK, when this happened. About 4, now 7, years ago, I was lying in my bed in my parents' house. My bed was right next to the window, when I was woken up by a horrible screaming and wailing noise in our back garden at 3 a.m. It was like the noise a terribly injured cat would make, but crossed with the noise of a screaming woman and a child. I opened the window and looked out, and I heard the noise again, but this time coming from the back garden of the house next door, then one more time from the third house, and then it stopped. This was the most terrifying, awful noise I ever heard, and my mind immediately jumped to holy duck, that was a banshee. You heard a ducking banshee, oh duck, while the rational part of my mind was going, no, come on, don't be silly. Something about that completely terrified me, and I knew something wasn't right about it, but I tried to convince myself it was a cat that had been hit by a car and had crawled off into the many hedges and bushes behind our houses to die. I went downstairs to go outside and see if I could find it, and my own cat was lying fast asleep. If he had heard it too, he would have been at the window looking out. It was then that I realized I had only heard it. Freaked out, I went back to bed. The next morning, I was talking to my mom at breakfast and asked if she'd heard the noise. She said, no, but did you hear the terrible news? The man who lives in the house 2 doors down dropped dead at 3 a.m. last night. You must have heard the banshee. That was some scary shit. I know a lot of people think the whole fairies thing in Ireland is just made up for tourists, but actually, pretty much everyone here has seen or heard SHT like this or knows other people who have. Most families have a story about hearing the banshee before someone dies. It was the most horrible noise I ever heard, and I sincerely hope I never hear it again. Shudder. It wasn't a fox or a cat. Our house has a lot of foxes around it, they screech pretty much constantly, and this sounded totally different. There were lots of wailing cats, too. Yet my own cat didn't hear the noise. Also, there was no way it could have been an animal moving from garden to garden, as well as the high hedges. Each garden is also securely fenced between each hedge. But the sound moved from one garden into the next, and there was no noise of any movement that would have been pretty loud and rusty had it been a cat or fox climbing or pushing through the hedge. I used to live in Georgia when I was starting 6th grade. The bus stop I waited at usually had 4 to 5 kids there, but this morning it was just me and Bubba. His nickname was Bubba. It was quite foggy, but just a really gray late fall morning. I said good morning when I got there, then stood side by side. We were both just staring into the wall where the woods started across the road, and we were both quiet. After a few minutes, I saw this enormous bird fly out of nowhere. It was so large and black. I thought it was a vulture, but it was so freaking big from how far away it was. It was just beyond the tree line into the woods, flying along it. It flew about 50 to 60 feet, more like hovered, and only flapped its wings twice. But it was like watching a cartoon. It just disappeared as it flew behind a tree. I was just standing there for minutes after, like, WTF? Did I just witness that? Did I just imagine that? Bubba breaks the silence and says, did you see that, or am I crazy? I just exploded, like, WTF? And we were trying to discuss what just happened. I was young, but I wasn't stupid. I'm aware of how big birds can be. Even at that age, I'd seen big birds before with huge wingspans. This was just freakish and cartoonish, and it didn't move right. I've tried to brush it off, like maybe it was just a big black vulture, but everything about that event was just off, and I think about that a lot. I was new to Georgia, but Bubba grew up there. When I looked into his eyes, I knew this was different. I was 19, driving around town with a friend sometime after midnight, talking shit and listening to music. We drive past this road with a signpost to an area neither of us has heard of, despite both of us living in town our whole lives. I asked if she wanted to see where the road went. She said yes, so I pulled a U-turn, and off we went. It's a paved road with heavy trees on each side and a few houses. There was nothing unusual for either of us. I was living on a street like that at the time. Anyway, within about 5 minutes, the conversation just kind of dies off. And a few minutes after that, I started to get an uneasy feeling. Then we passed a kangaroo on the side of the road. It remained perfectly still, just turning its head to watch us drive past, and I got the distinct impression it was standing guard. After that, I just got more and more anxious. I ended up turning to my friend and saying, this is going to sound stupid, but can you? She was already taking her seatbelt off. I'll lock the back doors. We kept following the road even after that because we're stubborn witches and don't know when to admit defeat. It was at least half an hour, because my 60-minute cassette tape had flipped over twice, with 30 minutes of music on each side, between pulling onto the paved road and coming to a sign saying dirt road ahead. By this stage, I felt physically sick, and my skin was crawling. Without a word, I made the quickest 3-point turn I was able to do, and we headed back down the road. The closer we got back to the turnoff, the better I felt until we were back on the main road, where I felt like I could breathe easily again. We told a few people about it and were mostly dismissed. We didn't even drive past that turnoff without flinching or shuddering for a few months. The feeling of dread had been that strong. Then, about 6 months later, she turned to me out of nowhere and said, let's drive it during the day. So we went. My friend has both her phone and mine on her lap with emergency numbers punched in, and were playing upbeat pop music to try and keep us calm. It took us less than 5 minutes to reach the dirt road, and on checking the odometer, the paved section was only 1 kilometer long. Once again, we got the duck out of there. Have never been back. I have no idea what the hell was going on that night, but I can say with certainty that we were not meant to be there. Even 20 years later, if someone mentions the area on the signpost, we shudder, and recently I turned to her out of nowhere and said, "Hey, was that you with me on the road where?" Yes. And I don't want to talk about it. I go to a small town in Scotland for university. It's a pretty old university, and a lot of the buildings in the town are made of stone and date back a couple hundred years, including mine and my friend's flats. Her flat is this really old stone building near the sea, but the inside is super dark with high ceilings that never really get lit all the way, and it's always cold. Then again, Scotland. The house makes these weird noises at night too, like it's settling into hell, and it just feels like someone's watching you. Anyway, I was staying at my friend's a couple of weeks ago after a quiet night in. I was asleep in my friend's bed before she came home from work, and I had this horrible night terror that some girl in a white dress was going to cut off my legs. My mate gets home, and apparently I was just saying, "Not my legs, no, not my legs." When she asked what I was on about, I sat up and said, "No, that wasn't me, just go to sleep, don't worry." Which I don't recall doing and have never done before during a night terror. But the weirdest part was that as soon as I got back to sleep, her flatmate let out a blood-curdling scream and said she felt like her bottom half was being cut off and couldn't move. She said she had the weirdest pain in her legs the whole next day. Unbeknownst to us at the time, our friend had stayed alone in the flat for a week before everyone moved in and said she'd seen a little girl in white at the top of the stairs before she turned the light on. Which is great. I was 21, and I was going camping with some friends. My boyfriend and I couldn't make it to the site until much later. We weren't camping at a campground. It was in the middle of the woods, near a farming community. You had to drive down a dirt road for a while to get to the spot. When my and I pulled up around sunset, everyone else was packing their shit. They said that they saw something crazy, and they didn't want to camp there anymore. I asked what happened, and they said they were walking around the tree line and picking up wood for a fire when some creature came out of the bushes and charged at them. They said it was about 4 feet tall, gray, hairless, walked on 2 legs that were shaped kind of like kangaroos, and had long fangs that stuck out of its mouth. I thought they were ducking with me. I said whatever, and we all decided we were going to go to my house and chill for the night. I lived the closest to the area. I said I was going to go ahead and leave and pick up some beer. When I got to the end of the dirt road and turned onto the street, this thing was in the street. It ran off as soon as we turned towards it, but we were able to get a decent look at it. I have never been a believer in Bigfoot or the Chupacabra, but I believe that this thing might be what people are calling the Chupacabra. I never really told anyone about it because I didn't want to be labeled crazy. 4 years later, I was talking to a friend, and he told me that they came across this weird creature when they were hunting. It was exactly what we saw. From ages 5 to about 15, I used to spend my summers at my aunt's house in Mexico. On her property was another smaller house with 2 bedrooms, a kitchenette, and a living room area. The family was mom and dad and 2 boys about my age. I was 11 or 12 at the time. I knew that the house was the second house that was built, as it replaced the previous house that had burned down before I was born. My aunt's house had windows on one side of the house. Each room had at least 2 to 3 windows from mid-wall to the ceiling. The bed was next to the windows in the room I was in. And for the majority of the summers, we slept with the top windows open. They opened out instead of up. One night, as I slept, I was awakened by the sounds of a woman crying and pleading to be allowed in. I opened my eyes and could see the neighbor's mom, dressed in white, begging to be let into her house. Now, I knew the dad was a drunk and could be mean when he was drunk. I remember many times that the boys and mom would come to my aunt's house in the middle of the night. So I just thought it was her and that he had locked her out of the house. She continues to yell, and I continue to look at her. That's when I realized that it wasn't the mother. This woman has long white hair. She's dressed in white. She's at the door, but her dress is flowing. I quickly sat up to get a better look. That's when she stops and turns to look at me. Even though she's about 50 yards away, I see her face. And it's not the mother. She starts gliding towards me. I close my eyes and lay back down on my side. I opened my eyes, and she was past the stone wall. I shut my eyes again. It seems like I've had my eyes closed forever. I open my eyes, and she's right in front of me. There is blackness where her eyes should be. Her white hair flowing around her. She screams. I scream. The next thing I know, my cousin is waking me up for breakfast. I come into the kitchen and take the empty seat at the table. My aunt then asks if I'm okay, if I'm homesick, and if I want to go home. It has only been a week, and I look forward to these summers. I told her no. She asks, "Are you sure? You were crying last night." I told her it wasn't me that was crying, but the mom next door. My cousins look at each other and then at my aunt. Then they look at me, and my aunt says, "So you saw her?" That's when I remembered the woman in white. Come to find out that they have all seen her at least once. The story was that the woman in white was the previous mom who lived in the house before it burned down. Much like the family that lives there now, it was a family of 4, a father, a mother, and 2 boys. And like the family now, the father was a mean and vengeful drunk. One night, before he went on a drinking binge, they fought about him going and drinking their funds away. She tells him that if he leaves to go drinking, she'll take the boys and leave him. He leaves, she packs her things and is ready to leave, but she decides to go after him instead. A couple of hours later, he returns to what he thinks is an empty house. He gets angry and starts to burn the house down. He walks by a nearby tree and passes out. She comes to the house on fire and runs to the door. She's banging on the door to be allowed in. Unknown to the father, the house was not empty, the boys were asleep in their room. Neighbors say that they could hear the woman's cries for several blocks. After the fire was extinguished, it was confirmed that the boys had died in the fire. The woman cries and weeps again. And she dies of a broken heart among the burned remains of the house. My aunt tells me that the family that lives there now is the 6th family to have lived in that house. And it's the first time in years that the ghost woman has appeared. She had appeared frequently in the past when the previous families lived in the new house. Those families didn't stay long. But the current family was different than the previous ones, but the same as her family, a mother, a father, and 2 boys. And they were moving out later that summer. And that's why she appeared again. I went back to my aunt's house during the summers until I turned 15. I never saw her again. But I will never forget her wails and her soulless eyes. My dad and I were living in a house that was built in 1910. The basement was extremely creepy and had no lights. There was a space about 3 feet high between the doorway and the first step. That space went directly under the house. I was on a weird sleep schedule, so I was usually up until 4 a.m. or so. On a nightly basis, I would walk past the basement door and see it open just a crack. Of course, my cat would be missing, undoubtedly in the basement. I would have to step all the way down to that first step, squat down, and stare into the void under the house to coax her out. Once she got close, I would have to stick my arms in to grab her and leap out. One night, I was recording vocal and acoustic tracks for a cover song in a room near the basement door. I was the only one home. When I played it back in my headphones, "Oh death," I would breathe my last. I heard a man's voice say the last word with me, "breath." I replayed it several times, and it was definitely there. I immediately got the hell out of there, and as I passed the basement door, I saw that it was open a crack. I figured my cat was down there again. He hopped down, scared as shit, looked under the house, and called her. She was a Siamese, and her coat was kind of cream-colored. I saw something light moving around about 3 feet into the void. I was reaching in to grab her, and I felt a cold draft hit my face. Right as that happened, I looked up to see my ducking cat come to the doorway from the kitchen to see what I was doing. I grabbed that cat and sprinted out of there. I didn't sleep for a week. I am the oldest of 6 kids. One passed away as an infant. My 2 younger sisters and one of my younger brothers used to like to push their mattresses together on the floor downstairs on the weekends and watch movies or sleep. My youngest brother still slept in his crib upstairs as he was still too young to roam the house at night, as we had 2 staircases leading to the basement that he could easily fall down. One evening, as my sisters and brother were about to fall asleep watching a movie, my youngest brother appeared at the bottom of the stairs. It startled them awake and confused them, as he should have been in his bedroom sleeping. They asked him what he was doing. He just smiled, then turned around and ran around the corner to the staircase. My sister followed, but when she reached the bottom of the staircase, he wasn't there. It wasn't possible. The kid had to climb stairs on all 4s, and it took him minutes to climb them. Confused, my sister ran upstairs and asked my parents what my little brother was doing downstairs. They checked on him, and he was sleeping in bed. All 3 of my brothers and sisters cried hysterically that night because they knew what they saw and it didn't make sense. They still swear by it today. About 10 years ago, I used to live in an area that had previously plotted a somewhat famous horse track some 100 years ago. The foundation for the announcer's tower could still be found in the woods nearby. This isn't relevant to the story, though, I don't think so, at least. Anyways, I grew up with 2 older sisters and was the only man in the house most of the time. Mom and dad split kind of early. They claimed they had several weird and scary events growing up, and while I did have a few strange ones that I couldn't really explain, only one stands out as something that was truly scary to me. So in this house that was built on the same land where the horse track used to be, I had the majority of odd events, including one that was terrible. My oldest sister had already moved out, and my next oldest sister was usually anywhere but home. My mom was usually at her boyfriend's house, so I pretty much always had the house to myself. A lot of the time, I would have people over to hang out and stay over. If not, I was somewhere else. So basically, no one was ever there alone. One of the few times I was there alone, I got bored and uncomfortable, so I wandered into my sister's room and started playing Xbox. Well, eventually I was able to calm down and fall asleep playing Oblivion. I woke up a bit later to static on the TV. I guess after a while of no input, the control turns off, then the console will turn off. The room was ridiculously cold, and a kind of buzz was in the air. I look over to the door, and it's opened up a bit. I see what looks like a shadowed figure in the doorway creeping into the room. It was dark, and most of the light was coming from the TV. When I looked at it, it kind of oriented itself to me, and it kind of whispered or started breathing in a weird but I got like weak and panicky. I had started to get up but could barely move. I may be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure I heard it say it had me and I belonged to it now, or something. I got really mad and just screamed, "No." Just like that, it was over. The room got warmer and less dark, I could move, and the shadow vanished. It was like breaking through a sheet of water. I was so worn out after that, but I felt better. I felt comfortable for the first time in that house in a long time. I got up, looked around, and fell back to sleep. After that, the house didn't seem to bother me as much, and I moved a few months later anyway. Over the next couple years, I heard from several friends that they hated being alone at my house, especially the females. Years later, I was with my sister in her truck, driving out of town for work. We were swapping old stories and got around to paranormal stuff. I laughed and told her about the weird event that I had in her old room. I hadn't told anyone else. I don't often share those stories. She got visibly upset and started crying. She said that she wouldn't stay in the house alone because she had similar experiences that happened the exact same way. I came to find out later that so did my mom and my oldest sister, though their stories were slightly different. It was definitely one of the more scary paranormal things that happened while I was growing up, but not the only one by far. Even in that house, I've got probably half a dozen weird events from that house. So a long time ago, probably about 4 years ago, I was visiting a friend, and everything went as normal. Me and her talking about stuff, her parents arguing, her little sister bitching at her mom about something, the usual family dynamic. Well, it was probably about 10 p.m. that I decided to leave. I got in my car as normal, turned on the ignition, and drove off slowly to warm up the car. Well, as I was driving, I was making a turn and passing homes, and I remember the radio being off when suddenly I got the most terrifying feeling. I felt like someone was in the backseat of my car. However, it wasn't just anyone. I remember getting flashes of this crazy, skinny old man curled in the fetal position, acting like he was having a seizure, and screaming. Blood-curdling screaming. My brain caught these images and developed the screams, but it was all so real to the point where the hair on the back of my neck stood up and I could feel my face and hands prickling. All I kept doing was checking the rearview mirror, waiting to find this man in the backseat of my car. I would turn my head, and there was nothing. The screams were so loud and terrifying. Once I finally got to my senses and turned the radio on, I was able to calm down. Months after that night, the convulsing man and his screams didn't want to leave my brain for some reason. And when I would sit or just be in silence, I would hear his screams and see him. But that night, it was surreal and didn't make any sense as to why this thing infiltrated my brain, but it did. I've never felt so terrified and confused in all my life. To this day, I can still see him, but it's quiet now. He rarely crosses my mind when I go to visit her, but I can't explain that night. Total fear is what it was, and there was nothing to prove my feeling. I always wondered if maybe I picked up a spirit, a demon, or something. The feeling was so malicious and torturous, like watching someone die and knowing there's nothing you can do about it. This is probably more silly than creepy, but it's definitely unexplained. Years ago, I suddenly started having dreams about meat. I'd walk into my apartment, and there'd be steaks and roasts just all over the place. Always raw and always choice cuts. I've never dreamed about food, and although I love a good steak, I prefer to cook it, so this was weird. I started writing down the dreams since they were so odd. Soon I realized that whenever I'd wake up from a meat dream, my dog would be in my bed, asleep, and touching me. So I started wondering about the dream transfer but told myself that was crazy. Then one day my husband started telling me he was having these weird dreams about meat. He says I'm going to think he's crazy, but he thinks our dog's dreams are getting into his head because he only has them when our 120-pound dog sleeps in bed with us. My dog was huge, so if he was in bed with us, he was always touching you, whether he threw himself across both legs or just had a paw on your arm. He described a few dreams very similar to mine and couldn't believe it when I showed him the notes I took. This continued for years for both of us until my dog stopped sleeping in our bed when he got older. Hasn't happened since. When I was a kid in Nee, Oklahoma, I was lucky enough to live in a neighborhood that was almost entirely elderly, retired couples, and vacation homes that were empty 50 weeks of the year. This gave me an incredible opportunity to be a free-range kid. One summer day, when I was probably 9 or 10, I was riding my bike around my neighborhood, and my perpetually untied shoelaces became wrapped in the chain and pedal sprocket. This was not an uncommon occurrence, so I did what I always do and plopped down in a field to unsnarl the mess I had made. It was a particularly bad tangle, so after about 5 minutes of struggling, I leaned back to take a break. It was then that I peered down the road I had been riding on and saw a plastic grocery bag in the distance blowing across the asphalt. Only it suddenly stopped moving. I distinctly remember thinking it had become snagged on a mailbox, as there were several empty homes down that particular street, and I knew there was a cluster of boxes in that general vicinity. As I continued to watch, the bag began to change shape. As I had already made up my mind that it was just a piece of plastic, I thought that was strange and became riveted. As I stared, this thing began to very obviously get closer and closer to me. Like the wind had changed direction and was now headed straight for me. It was at that point that the shape began to resolve itself into a human form. Running directly towards me but as silent as a tomb. That's when I began to get scared. I quickly stood myself and my bike back up and wrenched my shoelace out of the bike chain through sheer panic. As I pedaled away in fear, the last glance I took revealed a man in a white robe with his head covered by a white, pointed hood. It wasn't until years later that I realized it looked disturbingly like a Klansman. I've since chalked it up to an overwrought imagination or the heat of the Oklahoma summer. But the fact that it was before I was aware of what the Klan was or looked like and that it was in an area of the country where that organization was prevalent for decades still makes me wonder exactly what the hell I saw. Night fishing from some rocks with a friend about 20 years ago. We'd been fishing with a couple of lads from our campsite. We packed up and headed back up the cliff about 2 a.m. and took our usual shortcut back across some farmers' fields, leaving the other two lads behind to walk the normal route back along the cliff tops. A few fields in, we saw a light behind us and assumed they'd decided to follow us, so we flashed our torches at them. Nothing. We carried on, then looked around again and waited a minute for them to catch us up. The light was moving towards us fast, and we suddenly panicked that it was a pissed-off farmer on a quad bike coming to chase us off his land, so we carried on and picked up the pace a bit. In the next field, we looked again and realized it was a lot closer, too much closer to be anyone on foot. We realized the light wasn't bobbing around either, it was pretty rough ground, and on such a calm, quiet night, we couldn't hear any engines either. We started running, and every time we crossed a border fence or ditch, we checked behind us, and every time the light was gaining on us. At the last field before the campsite, it was out of our line of sight. My friend chose this moment to slip down the slope on the other side of the fence and get his foot stuck in the wires. We wrenched his foot free, then grabbed an air rifle and machete from our caravan. The blood was pumping, and we needed to take our catch to the freezers. We stopped up at the shower block and were leaning against a wall with a cigarette, talking about what we'd seen, when we heard a noise around the corner getting louder. Suddenly a massive shape burst out in front of us, and we both froze with fear, arms pinned against the wall, and screamed like little girls. Not my proudest moment. It turned out it was the ducking campsite dog, a great big golden retriever. A couple of minutes later, the two lads we'd been fishing with strolled back into the campsite from their journey back down the normal route. We worked it out, and it couldn't possibly have been them behind us. I'm still not sure to this day what it was. I'm not a big believer in supernatural things, and I think there's a rational explanation for it. I've just never been able to think about what it is.